Okay, so in today's video, what I wanted to do was run through some scenarios of using dual amps on the Quad Cortex. This is something that I've used quite a bit in terms of whether it's using 2 amps of different kinds or 2 amps of the same kind. And I feel like in doing that, I'm at least making some assumptions of what I think will work best, but I've never really put some of those assumptions to the test. And I wanted to do that here today in this video. So what I've set up here is a preset that we're going to use for testing different scenarios. If you notice, I'm running 2 different lines, and I'm switching between those 2 via scenes here. This scene is lines 1 and 2, and this one's will be 3 and 4. I'm doing that by just adjusting the output volume of the output block. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this to test some kind of A/B tests on different tones. So right now, I've just got a regular LoneStar clean, one of my favorite amps on the Quad Cortex. I'm running that through a single IR. A lot of times I'll use a dual IR, but for this, I wanted to keep the IR or the cabs as simple as I could. And so the tone on its own, line 1, just sounds like this. So it's just kind of a nice basic clean, maybe towards edge of breakup. So for our first kind of test, let's go ahead and add in a duplicate amp. I'm just going to copy this amp down to here. And for this test, let's go ahead and pan these kind of far left and far right. And let's compare that against a single amp. So my assumption has always been that if you take 2 amps of the exact same type, with the exact same settings, that in the end, it's just going to sound like 1 amp. Because unlike in a real world where you might run 2 amps that are the same and maybe you have the same settings on them, each amp is going to have a little bit of a difference to it. And in a room, you're going to hear that there's 2 amps running. But in a digital world, these amps should be exactly the same. So let's go ahead and compare this. So here is the 2 amps. And if we compare it against the single amp, so I think there's a little bit of difference, maybe just because of levels. Let's compare the levels here. Yeah, they're about the same. It's almost like the single amp actually sounds a little fuller. And sometimes that's because when you do a split, it'll drop the levels a little bit. So maybe we would push up these levels just a tad, and that might even it out. So we see when we duplicate an amp of the same type with the same settings, we're really not getting any benefit, I don't think. Now, obviously, if you were running like a stereo chorus in front of these amps, you would be getting a benefit, but because by splitting into 2 amps, you're maintaining a stereo signal. So we'll put that aside for now, but in terms of the tone of the amp, we're not really getting a difference here. Let's try tweaking the sound of the amps just a little bit, meaning let's take this one and we're going to pull back the gain a little bit, maybe give it a little more bass, a little more mids. Maybe on this one we'll bring back the treble just a little bit, and we'll pull up the master just a little bit. And on this one, maybe we'll give it a little more gain, maybe pull back the mids a little bit, maybe give it a little more presence, just to get a certain amount of variation. And so we'll go back to lines 1 and 2. So here's the 2 amps. I probably should have said this at the beginning, but obviously we're going to be dealing with a lot of stereo-ness of these tones, so it's best to listen either with kind of a good spread in terms of computer monitors or maybe with headphones. So mean, I don't think it's really much of a difference there. Let's try something different. Let's go ahead and we're gonna get rid of these. Let's take this one and just copy the device up here. And let's try, with the LoneStar, one of the things I like to do is run one with a certain EQ setting and one with a different one. So that way we're getting a little bit of a different feel. So I think we're continuing to see that without much variation, I don't feel like we're really getting that much of a difference. Obviously, they sound a little bit different because we're tweaking, a lot of this EQ settings, but I don't know that the 2 amp sounds fuller in any way. Maybe one thing we could do is let's mess around with the mix a little bit. So right now we're painting the amps kind of hard left, hard right. One of the things I like is the more different the amps are, I tend to don't like that full split because then it sounds very much, you're getting 2 amps from 2 different directions. If you're really in the room with them, you kind of get to mix them together. So let's go ahead and pull these back a little bit. Maybe about halfway split. Now, as we combine the 2 amps together and start to bring them more towards the center, one thing I have noticed is that's when you can start to get a little more volume out of running 2 amps. So let's bring those down a little bit. I think the difference we're hearing, well, first you can see we're getting a little bit more on the left than on the right. So let's go ahead and pull this back. The thicker EQ amp is typically going to be a little louder. That's closer. And then let's try just mixing them full, kind of down in the middle. And again, I think we're probably going to need to pull these back a little bit. So I do think we're getting a thicker tone. Still trying to make sure it's not just a difference in volume. I think we're definitely hearing the difference in the EQ settings. I think when you add this to the thicker, you're getting a little more presence out of this amp. Even bring that down a little bit. But it does sound somewhat fuller. So let's go ahead and move on from comparing to one amp. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to get rid of that. Let's duplicate our amp settings here. And let's compare kind of down the middle there. And we'll do this one kind of at 25. And just start comparing the way the stereo spread should be on the 2 amps. So right now this is both right down the middle. And then this one would be somewhat spread. So I think the down the middle is a little louder, so let's go ahead and tweak that a little bit. I do think that little bit of separation makes it sound a little fuller. Let's compare it. So we'll leave this one on the 25, and let's go up to this one, and let's just do a full spread. So this is all the way left and right. So I think one of the things I like about the partial is when you do pan them fully left and right, you're getting way more treble from the amp that has the thicker tone, because it tends to add more presence, versus the one that's on normal is more of kind of a roundish, warmer, Fender-y kind of thing. So when you pan them fully left and right, I think it starts to distort where you hear the treble coming from, whereas when you come up through kind of partial left and right, you still get a little bit of a spread, but you're still also getting a spectrum of EQ that's mostly from the full sound. So let's set this back to kind of our starting point. We're going to add in a new type of amp. I like mixing with a plexi. And we'll go ahead and maybe give a little more gain, a little more bass. Maybe bring the treble down a little bit. And then we'll bring the presence down quite a bit too. Now, you can hear that's really quiet. That's mostly because, and I've noticed this, the LoneStar and the Plexi have phase issues when you try to run them together. So we go to the mixer, we turn on the phase. Let's look at, looks like the Marshall could be a little quieter and the Plexi could be a little louder. And let's go ahead and copy the Plexi tone. So now we're the same. Let's, again, compare. So let's put both right up the middle. And let's compare it against putting it all the way to the outside. So it sounds good, kind of panned fully left and right. But I do like it better kind of combined. it starts to sound like one bigger sounding amp versus 2 amps panned left and right, which is kind of what it is. I might do a little bit of a pan, again, just to do a little bit of a spread. Now again, this completely changes if you're trying to run some stereo effects into the front of the amps. So if you want a ping pong delay in the front or a stereo chorus, then you need a pan left and right to some extent to maintain that stereo effect in the amps. And you'll need to adjust your splitter. And I did a whole video on doing that kind of thing, and I'll link to it here. But for now, we're not going to worry about that. We're just wondering, how do the amps sound? So what do I come away from this video? First off, I think it's definitely reinforced that running dual amps of the same amp type, especially if you have generally the same settings, I don't know that it really gets you much, especially when you think about the cost and the amount of CPU. Especially the LoneStar is a heavy amp in terms of CPU usage, if you've ever looked at that. I mean, these are heavy amps from a CPU usage. The second thing I would say is, in terms of the spread of how to set the amps, I am kind of coming back towards less of a stereo spread. So unless you're trying to maintain a stereo effect in front of it, I think keeping the amps either straight down the middle or just slightly left and right, I think you get a better tone overall and you get a more consistent sound across the whole speaker spread, so to speak. So coming out of this, I think I might maybe do less dual amps. And when I do them, it'll be because I'm using 2 different amps. So some of the presets that I've built where I'm using basically the same amp. And so I think it's definitely leading me towards combining amps together rather than trying to run 2 amps with slightly different settings, trying to get more of a bigger sound. I don't know that it really works. You know, if we go look at my LoneStar rig, let's go ahead and look at that. So I'm running dual amps here. And so, you know, it's like this is a dual clean amp. And here I'm doing kind of the same thing we kind of did in our test. I'm running both clean normals, just with slightly different settings. I don't know that it really makes that much of a difference. Let's go ahead and just get rid of this. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the stereo amps. So we're not going to use them. There's a little bit of a volume drop there, but so overall, I think this might lead me away from that mentality of, well, if I run 2 amps, it'll sound bigger. I think that's not going to be the case. I think in general, 2 amps is only making it sound not necessarily even bigger, but different if you're running 2 different amps and combining them in certain ways. And I think when doing that, I'm definitely liking them more towards the center than spreading them out far left and right. So I think this will definitely lead me to be a little more economical in terms of how many amp blocks that I'm running in some of these presets. So this was interesting for me. I hope it was interesting for you. I hope you got some ideas out of this. In the comments below, let me know how you're using dual amps on the Quad Cortex and kind of the results that you're seeing. And as always, thanks for watching.